The snow on Henrik Voss's roof stood 3 feet deep, with diagonal trenches carved across its surface like deliberate scars. Every other cabin in the settlement lay collapsed under drifts, their occupants huddled in the trading post, but warm light still glowed through Henrik's window as if the blizzard had never come. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. Henrik Voss stood in snow up to his knees, studying the geometry of survival carved into his own rooftop. The morning after the blizzard of 1872 revealed a landscape transformed by catastrophe. 4 cabins within sight had collapsed during the night, their roof beams snapped like kindling under snow that had fallen without pause for 3 days straight. Frank Dalton's place was closest, its ridgeline sagging into a V-shape that told the story of failure in a single glance. The Merrill cabin beyond that had lost its entire south wall when the roof caved inward. Smoke no longer rose from their chimneys because there were no chimneys left standing, but Henrik's cabin stood exactly as he had left it before the storm began. The 5 diagonal trenches he had carved into the accumulated snow remained crisp and clean, each channel 8 inches deep and angled at 45 degrees from ridge to eave. The snow between the trenches formed raised ridges that distributed the massive weight across the reinforced structure beneath. He had calculated the load capacity during the summer, had built the roof with that specific burden in mind, and now the mathematics had proven themselves in the most unforgiving laboratory imaginable. People were emerging from the trading post where most of the settlement had taken refuge when their own homes became unlivable. They moved through the snow like survivors of a shipwreck, their faces showing the exhaustion of 3 days spent in cramped quarters, wondering if the building would hold. Frank Dalton was among them, his eyes moving from his own ruined cabin to Henrik's intact structure, with an expression that combined disbelief and something that might have been anger or might have been shame. Henrik had heard the predictions all winter. Every time snow accumulated on his roof and he refused to clear it, someone had warned him about the inevitable collapse. Frank had been the most vocal, telling anyone who would listen that Henrik Voss was going to get himself killed with his fool theories about snow management. The entire settlement had watched Henrik carve his trenches after each snowfall, had seen the weight build up week after week, and had waited for the disaster they were certain would come. The disaster had come, just not for Henrik. He turned his attention back to his roof, checking the trench depth with the practiced eye of someone who had spent months perfecting a technique that no one else understood. The blizzard had added roughly 18 inches of new snow on top of what was already there, but the trench system had held. The channels allowed enough air circulation to prevent the bottom layers from turning to ice, maintained drainage paths for any melting that occurred, and, most importantly, segmented the total load into manageable sections that his reinforced structure could support indefinitely. Frank Dalton was walking toward him now, moving slowly through the deep snow. Henrik watched him come, saying nothing. There would be questions now. There would be requests to explain how he had known, how he had built something that survived when everything else failed. But the knowing had come at a price that Frank and the others knew nothing about, and that price was the reason Henrik had spent an entire summer obsessing over snow loads and roof pitch angles and the physics of distributed weight. The reason was buried on a hillside 2 miles from here, under a stone marker that bore a single name: Wilhelm. Winter in the frontier territories followed patterns that men treated as immutable law. Snow accumulated on roofs. Men climbed up with shovels and cleared it off. This cycle repeated every few days throughout the cold months, and everyone accepted the danger and labor as unavoidable facts of mountain life. The alternative, allowing snow to build up, meant certain structural failure. Every trapper, every settler, every trading post operator knew this. It was wisdom passed from experienced men to newcomers, reinforced by occasional disasters when someone got lazy or injured, and couldn't maintain their clearing schedule. Henrik had believed this completely until the morning of February 9, 1871, when he returned from checking his trap lines to find his brother buried under 12 feet of snow and splintered logs. Wilhelm Voss had been clearing the roof. They had discussed it at breakfast, noting how the accumulation after 4 days of steady snowfall had reached the point where clearing became necessary. Henrik had offered to do it, but Wilhelm had insisted on handling the task while Henrik checked the traps. It was a routine division of labor they had practiced dozens of times over 3 winters of working their claim together. The collapse happened around midday, based on the evidence Henrik pieced together later. Wilhelm had cleared perhaps 2/3 of the roof, piling snow at the cabin's north end, as was standard practice. The weight of that pile, combined with his own weight on the weakened structure, had exceeded what the roof beams could support. The entire system failed simultaneously. Notched log corners that had seemed solid pulled apart under the lateral force. Ridge poles cracked. The roof came down as a single catastrophic event, and Wilhelm was on top of it when it fell. Henrik found him 3 hours later. He dug through the wreckage with his bare hands, throwing aside snow and broken wood until he uncovered his brother's body. Wilhelm's neck was broken. He had died instantly, which was the only mercy in the entire situation. Henrik pulled him free and sat in the snow holding his brother until the light began to fail and cold forced him to move. He buried Wilhelm 2 days later on a hillside that overlooked their claim. The ground was frozen, making the work brutal, but Henrik refused help from neighboring trappers who came to pay respects. He dug alone, and when the grave was finished and Wilhelm was laid to rest, Henrik stood there as the sun set and made a decision that would define everything that followed. The conventional wisdom had killed his brother. The supposed safety of regular roof clearing had put Wilhelm on top of a structure weakened by the very act of clearing it. The labor that everyone accepted as necessary had created the conditions for failure. And Henrik realized, standing at that grave, that he would never again trust conventional wisdom without understanding the principles behind it. If men died following accepted practices, then perhaps the accepted practices were wrong. Spring came late to the mountains in 1872, and Henrik spent those months watching snow disappear with the intensity of a man studying an enemy he intended to defeat. He abandoned his trap lines almost entirely, losing income that would have sustained him through the next year. But the loss seemed irrelevant compared to what he was learning. Every hillside became a laboratory. Every remaining snowdrift offered lessons about weight distribution, structural integrity, and the physics of accumulated mass. He noticed patterns that he had overlooked during 3 previous winters. Natural snow formations on steep slopes didn't simply slide off in uniform sheets. Instead, they developed channels and ridges that redistributed weight along multiple vectors. The largest drifts, the ones that persisted longest into spring, showed diagonal striations, where wind and temperature variations had created natural segmentation. These massive formations could hold tons of snow on angles that seemed impossible, yet they remained stable for months, while smaller, seemingly safer accumulations would suddenly avalanche without warning. Henrik began hiking to the sites of collapsed cabins from the previous winter. 5 structures within a day's travel had failed, and he examined each one with systematic thoroughness. He measured the roof pitch angles using a simple plumb line and wooden square he had constructed. He studied how the log corners had failed, noting that every collapse showed the same pattern of lateral separation at the notched joints. He paced out the dimensions of each structure and calculated approximate snow loads based on the depth of remaining drifts in the surrounding area. A pattern emerged that contradicted everything the frontier community believed. The cabins that had collapsed weren't the ones with the most snow. They were the ones where men had been actively clearing snow and had either weakened the structure through repeated stress or had created dangerous weight concentrations by piling cleared snow incorrectly. Wilhelm's cabin had failed exactly this way. The pile of cleared snow at the north end had added localized stress that the structure couldn't handle. The act of clearing had created the conditions for catastrophic failure. Henrik filled a leather-bound journal with sketches and calculations through April and May. He drew roof cross-sections showing load distribution across beams. He calculated the weight of snow at various densities, discovering that fresh powder weighed roughly 7 pounds per cubic foot, while settled snow could reach 20 pounds or more. He made notes about insulation properties, observing that cabins buried in snow maintained more stable interior temperatures than those that were constantly cleared. By June, when the last snow had melted from even the deepest northern ravines, Henrik had developed a theory that he knew would sound insane to everyone in the settlement. The safest approach wasn't to clear snow frequently. It was to build structures specifically designed to hold snow, to manage it as a deliberate element of the building system, rather than treating it as a threat to be constantly removed. The question was whether he had the courage to stake his life on mathematics and observation that contradicted generations of accepted practice. Henrik began construction in late August when the weather was stable and daylight lasted long enough for sustained work. The location he selected was 200 yards from where Wilhelm's cabin had stood, on higher ground with better drainage and sight lines in every direction. Frank Dalton rode by during the first week and watched Henrik digging foundation trenches, something most frontier builders never bothered with. Frank said nothing that day, but his expression suggested he thought Henrik was wasting effort on unnecessary details. The foundation was just the beginning of what would become the most controversial structure in the territory. Henrik dug down 18 inches and filled the trenches with rocks he hauled from a creek bed half a mile away. The work took 12 days. The result was a level, stable base that would prevent settling and would keep the bottom logs elevated above ground moisture. Every other cabin in the area sat directly on earth, but Henrik had calculated that elevation and stability were essential for what he intended to build above. The roof pitch was where Henrik's design became openly heretical. Standard mountain cabin roofs used steep pitches, typically 8-12 or even 10-12 slopes, specifically designed to shed snow quickly. Henrik built his roof at 4-12, a pitch so shallow that Frank Dalton, watching from a distance, rode over specifically to ask if Henrik understood what he was doing. The conversation was brief. Frank explained that shallow roofs collected snow and collapsed. Henrik thanked him for the concern and continued working. Frank rode away, shaking his head. What Frank and the others couldn't see was the engineering Henrik had built into the structure beneath that shallow roof. The ridge beam wasn't a single log, but 3 logs bolted together with iron hardware Henrik had purchased in St. Louis the previous summer. The roof supports weren't spaced at standard 3-foot intervals, but at 18-inch centers, doubling the number of supports and having the load each one carried. Every joint was reinforced with iron brackets. Every connection point was designed to distribute force across multiple structural elements. Henrik notched his wall logs in the traditional manner, but he added an innovation that made the corners significantly stronger. After stacking each course of logs, he drilled vertical holes through the corner joints and drove iron pins 18 inches long through multiple logs simultaneously. The pins locked the corners into rigid assemblies that couldn't separate under lateral stress. The technique added 2 weeks to the construction schedule, but it eliminated the failure mode that had killed Wilhelm. By late October, the cabin was finished. It looked wrong to everyone who saw it. The roof was too flat. The walls seemed overbuilt. The foundation was unnecessarily elaborate. Frank Dalton started calling it Voss's Folly, and the name spread through the settlement quickly. Men made jokes about Henrik building a fortress to hold back snow that was just going to crush him anyway. Henrik ignored them and began stocking his cabin for winter, waiting for the snow that would prove whether his calculations were correct or fatal. The first significant snowfall came on November 18th, dropping 8 inches overnight. Henrik woke to find his roof covered in a uniform white blanket, while every other cabin in sight showed bare patches where steep pitches had shed the accumulation during the night. By mid-morning, Frank Dalton and two other settlers had stopped by, ostensibly to check on Henrik, but clearly motivated by curiosity about whether he planned to clear his roof. Henrik stepped outside and looked up at the snow load with satisfaction. The roof showed no sagging, no stress indicators, exactly as his calculations predicted. He told Frank he had no intention of clearing it. Frank asked if Henrik understood that more snow was coming, that winter had just started, that by January there could be 3 feet up there. Henrik said he understood perfectly. Frank left, shaking his head, and by evening the entire settlement had heard that Henrik Voss was going to let snow pile up all winter without clearing it once. The second snowfall added 6 more inches 3 days later. Henrik climbed onto his roof using a ladder he had built specifically for safe access, with a padded top that wouldn't damage the log walls. He stood on the accumulated snow and felt it compress slightly under his weight, but hold firm. The structural integrity was exactly what he had designed for. But standing up there, he realized he needed to implement the second phase of his system earlier than planned. He retrieved a tool he had spent 2 weeks fabricating in September, a device that looked like a cross between a grain shovel and a garden hoe. The blade was 18 inches wide, made from a sheet of iron he had hammered flat and sharpened along one edge. The handle was 6 feet long, allowing him to work while distributing his weight across the snow surface. Using this tool, Henrik carved his first trench. He started at the ridge and worked downward at a 45-degree angle, cutting through the snow in a clean line from top to bottom. The trench was 8 inches deep, narrow enough to carve quickly, but deep enough to segment the snow into distinct sections. He carved 4 more trenches parallel to the first, spacing them 20 inches apart, creating 5 channels that divided his roof into manageable zones. The work took 90 minutes. When he climbed down, Frank Dalton was standing in the yard, watching. Frank asked what in God's name Henrik thought he was doing up there. Henrik explained that the trenches distributed weight and created drainage channels. Frank said it looked like Henrik was making the problem worse by weakening the snow mass. Henrik suggested they wait and see. Frank told him he was going to get himself killed with fool theories, and Henrik would be lucky if the cabin lasted until Christmas. Word spread faster than before. By the next day, half the settlement had ridden by to see the crazy trenches Henrik had carved into his roof. The name evolved from Voss's Folly to the Snow Trench Roof, spoken with the kind of mockery reserved for ideas that seemed obviously doomed. Henrik refined his technique through December as snow continued to accumulate. Each new snowfall required reassessment of the trench depth and pattern. He discovered that 8 inches was optimal for most conditions, deep enough to segment the load, but shallow enough to maintain the insulating properties of the retained snow. The 45-degree angle wasn't arbitrary. It followed the natural drainage path that meltwater would take, and it created cross-bracing vectors that distributed weight across multiple support beams simultaneously. The tool he had fabricated became essential to the entire system. The 18-inch blade width matched the spacing between roof supports beneath the snow, allowing him to align trenches with the underlying structure even though he couldn't see it. The 6-foot handle let him work from a standing position, distributing his body weight across a larger snow surface area and reducing the risk of breaking through. He sharpened the blade every 3 days, maintaining an edge that could slice through compacted snow with minimal effort. Access to the roof required a safety system that Henrik developed through trial and error. His ladder was built with extra-wide rungs spaced closer together than standard construction. The top of the ladder extended 2 feet above the roof line and was padded with leather wrapped around the contact points. He never climbed onto the roof during active snowfall or high winds. He never worked alone without telling someone at the trading post his schedule. These protocols seemed excessive to observers, but Henrik had watched his brother die from a routine task, and he refused to underestimate the dangers of working at height in winter conditions. The mathematics behind the trench spacing involved calculations that Henrik had worked out on paper during the summer. His roof measured 20 feet wide. Dividing that width into 5 zones with 4 trenches created segments that were approximately 40 inches wide. Each segment could hold roughly 120 pounds of snow per linear foot of length before approaching the load capacity of the support beams beneath. With 5 trenches creating 6 ridges, the total distributed load remained well within the structural limits he had engineered into the roof frame. Temperature differentials played a role Henrik hadn't fully anticipated during his planning phase. The trenches created air gaps that allowed cold air to circulate beneath the snow mass. This circulation prevented the bottom layer from melting and refreezing into solid ice, which would have dramatically increased the weight. The snow remained in a stable, powdery state, compacting gradually under its own weight, but never transitioning into the dense, heavy ice that formed on roofs without proper ventilation. By mid-December, Henrik's roof held 22 inches of snow divided into geometric patterns that looked deliberate and strange against the natural accumulations on surrounding hillsides. Frank Dalton continued to predict imminent collapse. Other settlers placed informal wagers on whether Henrik would survive the winter. The trading post operator started keeping a count of days since construction, assuming the total would matter when the inevitable disaster occurred. Henrik ignored all of it and continued carving his trenches after each snowfall, trusting mathematics over consensus. January brought the heaviest snows anyone in the settlement could remember. Storm systems moved through every 4 to 5 days, each depositing 6 to 10 inches of new accumulation. By the 3rd week of the month, Henrik's roof held 31 inches of snow, carved into trenches that he now maintained with the precision of a craftsman perfecting his signature work. The weight above his head while he slept exceeded 2,000 pounds, distributed across a structure that showed no signs of stress. Other cabins in the settlement were experiencing problems. Jacob Merrill's roof developed a sag along the ridge line, despite his religious adherence to clearing schedules. The constant cycle of loading and unloading created fatigue in the wooden beams, microscopic cracks that accumulated into visible deflection. Amos Webb at the trading post had to replace 2 support beams in his main storage building after one cracked during a clearing operation. The work required jacking up the roof, a dangerous procedure in winter conditions, and cost him 3 days of lost business. Frank Dalton appeared at Henrik's cabin on January 23rd with 2 other men carrying shovels. They announced they were going to help Henrik clear his roof before the weight killed him. It was an intervention staged with good intentions and absolute certainty that they were preventing a tragedy. Henrik met them in his doorway and politely declined the assistance. Frank argued that the snow load was suicidal, that no structure could hold what Henrik had accumulated up there, that simple mathematics proved the roof would fail. Henrik invited them inside and showed them his calculations. He had documented everything in his leather journal, including the engineering specifications of his roof frame, the load capacity of each beam, the weight of snow at various densities, and the distribution pattern created by his trench system. He walked them through the physics of distributed loads, explaining how segmenting the snow into independent sections prevented any single point from exceeding its capacity. Frank looked at the numbers and said, mathematics on paper didn't change reality. And reality was that roofs collapsed under heavy snow. The conversation ended with Frank warning Henrik that he was going to die for his stubbornness, and when the cabin collapsed, no one would be surprised. Henrik thanked them for their concern and closed the door. Through his window, he watched them trudge back through the snow, their conviction unshaken. They had seen cabins collapse. They had personal experience that confirmed their worldview. Henrik's mathematics and theory couldn't compete with the visceral reality of past disasters, but Henrik had his own visceral reality. He remembered digging Wilhelm out of the wreckage of a cabin that had collapsed during a clearing operation. He remembered the exact angle of his brother's broken neck, the way the roof beam had struck him when the structure failed. That memory drove him more powerfully than any theoretical calculation. The trenches on his roof weren't just an engineering experiment. They were a refusal to accept that the conventional approach was the only approach, that the wisdom which had killed his brother deserved to be called wisdom at all. The storm arrived on February 7th, with a ferocity that turned the sky dark gray by mid-morning. Wind came first, gusting hard enough to shake the cabin walls and drive ice crystals through the smallest gaps in the chinking. Snow followed an hour later, not falling gently, but driving horizontally across the landscape with such force that visibility dropped to less than 20 yards. Henrik had seen serious storms during his years in the mountains, but within the first 3 hours he understood this was something different. This was the kind of weather that killed unprepared travelers and tested every structure to its absolute limits. He spent the first day monitoring his cabin's performance with systematic attention to detail. Every 2 hours he checked the walls for new gaps, inspected the door seal for drafts, and examined the ceiling logs for any signs of sagging or stress. The fireplace drew properly despite the wind, the smoke shelf he had built deflecting downdrafts exactly as designed. Interior temperature remained stable around 55 degrees, warm enough with his heavy coat and the heat from the fire. Outside, the thermometer mounted beside his door registered 8 degrees below zero, not accounting for wind, that made the actual conditions far more brutal. The snow accumulated with relentless consistency. By nightfall of the first day, Henrik estimated the storm had added 14 inches to what was already on his roof. He couldn't go outside to carve trenches in these conditions. The wind would have knocked him off the ladder, and visibility was too poor to work safely at height. He was committed now to trusting that his existing trench pattern and structural engineering would handle whatever load the storm delivered. The alternative was attempting roof access in conditions that would likely kill him even if the roof held. Sounds carried strangely through the storm. Around midnight on the second day, Henrik heard a deep crack, followed by a rumbling crash that echoed despite the wind. He knew immediately what it meant. Somewhere close, a cabin had collapsed. He couldn't tell which one from inside his own structure, couldn't see anything through his window except driving snow. He added wood to his fire and tried to sleep, but the knowledge that someone might be trapped kept him awake until exhaustion finally overcame anxiety around 3 in the morning. The storm continued through the entire second day without pause. Henrik rationed his firewood carefully, knowing he might need to make his supply last longer than anticipated. He melted snow for water, using a pot hung over the fire. He ate cold jerky and hardtack, avoiding cooking that would consume extra fuel. The cabin creaked and groaned under the accumulated weight above, sounds that would have terrified him a year ago, but now he recognized as normal structural response to loading. The logs compressed slightly, settling into their connections, but nothing shifted or failed. On the third day, the wind began to decrease. Snow continued falling, but without the horizontal violence of the previous 2 days. By afternoon, the storm had diminished to light flurries. Henrik waited until the wind stopped completely before opening his door. Snow had drifted against the entrance, and he had to force the door against the resistance, but it opened. He stepped outside into a transformed world. The settlement looked like a battlefield where buildings had been the casualties. Henrik counted 4 collapsed structures from where he stood in front of his cabin. Frank Dalton's place showed complete roof failure, the ridge line broken in the middle, and both sides sagging inward. The Merrill cabin had lost its entire north wall along with the roof section it supported. Amos Webb's storage building, the one he had just repaired in January, was flattened completely. Only the trading post and 2 other cabins remained intact, and those survivors had been cleared repeatedly during brief lulls in the storm by men risking their lives on ladders in dangerous conditions. Henrik's roof held 38 inches of snow by his measurement, possibly more in the drifted sections. The trenches he had carved before the storm were buried but still visible as shallow depressions in the snow surface. The diagonal pattern remained crisp despite 3 days of continuous accumulation. He could see no sagging in the roofline, no separation at the corners, no indication of stress anywhere in the structure. The mathematics had held. The engineering had performed exactly as designed. People emerged from the trading post throughout the morning, moving slowly through snow that reached their thighs in the drifted areas. They spread out to assess damage and search for anyone who might be trapped in collapsed structures. Henrik joined them, wading through the deep snow toward Frank Dalton's cabin. He found Frank already there, standing in front of the wreckage with an expression that combined exhaustion and defeat. The interior of Frank's cabin was exposed to the sky where the roof had caved in. Snow filled the space 3 feet deep, covering everything Frank owned. His stove was buried, his supplies were ruined. The structural damage was severe enough that rebuilding would require tearing down what remained and starting from scratch. Frank turned when Henrik approached, and for a long moment neither man spoke. Frank broke the silence with a simple question. "How did you know?" His voice carried no hostility, only genuine confusion from a man whose entire understanding of winter survival had just been proven inadequate. Henrik didn't gloat or lecture. He explained briefly about distributed loads, about how the trenches segmented the weight, about building the structure specifically to hold snow rather than shed it. Frank listened without interrupting, and when Henrik finished, Frank asked if Henrik would show him how to build a roof like that when spring came. By afternoon, 6 men had approached Henrik with similar requests. Jacob Merrill, whose family was now crowded into the trading post, wanted to know everything about the foundation work and roof pitch calculations. Amos Webb asked about the trench carving technique and whether it would work on his storage building. Even the trading post operator, whose structure had survived, admitted that constant clearing during the storm had been terrifying and dangerous, and he wanted to understand Henrik's approach for future construction. Henrik spent the evening sketching diagrams in his journal while men crowded into his cabin asking questions. He showed them his load calculations, explained the importance of proper support spacing, demonstrated his carving tool and access ladder. He held nothing back. The techniques weren't secrets to be protected, but solutions to common problems that killed people every winter. If sharing what he had learned prevented even one death, then Wilhelm's loss gained some measure of meaning beyond simple tragedy. Spring arrived in late March of 1873, and the sound of construction echoed through the settlement for the first time in years. Men who had lost cabins in the blizzard were rebuilding, but they weren't recreating what had failed. They were building low-pitch roofs, reinforced with doubled beams and iron brackets. They were spacing supports closer than tradition dictated. They were installing foundations that elevated bottom logs above the ground. The techniques varied based on individual skill and available materials, but the principles remained consistent across every new structure going up. Frank Dalton's new cabin took shape over 6 weeks, with Henrik providing occasional advice but never taking over the work. Frank had insisted on doing the construction himself, saying he needed to understand every joint and connection if he was going to trust the building with his life. His roof pitch came out at 412, identical to Henrik's. His support spacing was 18 inches center to center. He purchased iron brackets from a supplier in St. Louis and reinforced every critical connection point. When the cabin was finished in early May, Frank carved practice trenches in dirt piled on the roof, learning the technique before winter returned. Word spread beyond the immediate settlement through the network of trappers, traders, and travelers who moved between remote outposts. A fur buyer from Montana mentioned seeing a cabin with strange trenches carved in snow and asked Henrik about it during a spring visit. Henrik explained the system, and the trader carried the information north. A group of settlers heading to Oregon stopped at the trading post and noticed the unusual roof designs. They asked questions, took notes, and continued west with knowledge they would apply in their new territory. By 1875, variations of the technique had appeared across the northern Rocky Mountain region. Some builders used steeper pitches than Henrik's original 412 design. Others developed different trench patterns, experimenting with straight channels instead of diagonal ones, or varying the spacing based on local snow conditions. The core principle remained constant: build structures strong enough to hold snow, then manage that snow as a thermal and structural asset rather than treating it as a threat requiring constant removal. Henrik himself never built another cabin. His structure served him through 8 more winters before he left the mountains in 1881, relocating to lower elevation when age made frontier life impractical. He sold his claim to a young trapper who examined the cabin with appreciation for its engineering. Henrik spent 2 days explaining the roof system, demonstrating the trench technique, and reviewing his calculations. Then he packed his possessions and rode out. The cabin stood for another 43 years, maintained by successive occupants who continued carving trenches each winter. When it finally collapsed in 1924, the failure came from foundation rot, not snow load. By then, Henrik's principles had become standard practice across multiple territories, incorporated into construction knowledge that new settlers learned without ever knowing the name of the man who had pioneered the approach. Henrik Voss died in 1897 outside Spokane, his obituary mentioning his trapping years, but nothing about the innovation that had saved dozens of lives across the frontier.